Something is happening on the southern border that most Americans aren't being told the full story about. The United States military is now operating in spaces that just a few years ago would have triggered a constitutional crisis. Troops on Mexican soil, or close enough to it that the legal distinction is starting to blur. And here's what's fascinating: the political class is treating this like a logistics question, like a scheduling problem. But what it actually is a power signal, a message being sent not just to the cartels, not just to migrants, but to Mexico itself, to its sovereignty, to the entire framework of what we call a neighboring nation. President Scheinbaum responded. Measured, diplomatic, but make no mistake, behind those careful words was a government telling Washington, this is our territory. Now ask yourself, when capital needs cheap labor and open supply chains, but politics needs a militarized border to survive, what actually wins? That tension? That's not a border policy. That's the contradiction of late stage empire playing out in real time. Let's go back to the beginning of this because history matters here. And if you skip the history, you end up confused about the present. The United States and Mexico have one of the most economically intertwined, politically complicated, and historically loaded relationships in the entire world. These are not two countries that simply happen to share a border. These are two countries whose fates, whose economies, whose labor forces, whose cultures have been deliberately stitched together by decades of policy decisions. Decisions made not by ordinary people on either side of that border, but by the ownership class, by the corporate elite, by the trade negotiators who flew business class to meetings in Geneva and Washington and Mexico City and hammered out agreements that benefited capital while leaving workers on both sides holding the consequences. NAFTA, remember that word, the North American Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1994. Bill Clinton celebrated it. The business community celebrated it. The mainstream media called it progress. And what it actually did, what it functionally, materially did to real human beings, was dismantle the agricultural economy in Mexico so completely that millions of Mexican farmers could no longer compete with subsidized American corn flooding their markets. It wiped out livelihoods. It destroyed the economic foundation of entire rural communities. And those people, those farmers, those families, those workers who had nothing left, they moved. Some moved to Mexican cities, and many of them moved north toward that border, toward the United States, because that's what human beings do when capital destroys their ability to survive at home. They go somewhere else. They go where there might be work. They go where there might be a future for their children. So when politicians today stand in front of cameras and talk about the border crisis as if it materialized from nowhere, as if it's some mysterious force of nature that just appeared one day, they are either deeply ignorant of history or they are deliberately obscuring it. Because the roots of migration, the roots of what is happening on that southern border right now, go directly back to the economic policies that American corporations and American politicians championed for 30 years. The same people who pushed free trade agreements that gutted the Mexican working class are now the ideological ancestors of the people demanding militarization of the border to stop the very migration those policies created. You have to sit with that. You have to really let that land because it is one of the most profound contradictions in modern American political life. Now, here we are in 2025, and the Trump administration has announced what it is framing as an expansion of military operations at and near the southern border with Mexico. And depending on which news source you're reading, depending on which narrative you've been swimming in, this either looks like a bold, necessary national security move, or it looks like a deeply alarming precedent that has major implications for international law, for Mexican sovereignty, for the future of US-Mexico relations, and for what kind of country the United States is choosing to become. And I want to be honest with you, both of those readings contain something real. That's what makes this moment so important to examine carefully rather than just reacting emotionally in one direction or the other. Let's talk about what is actually being proposed and what has already been set in motion, because the details here matter enormously. The Trump administration has been pushing for the use of active duty military personnel in border enforcement in ways that go significantly beyond what previous administrations authorized. There is the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, a law from 1798 being used to justify rapid deportations. There is the designation of certain cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which opens the legal door to military action against them in ways that civilian law enforcement cannot authorize. And there are reports, some confirmed, some still being clarified, of military assets, military personnel, and military operational frameworks being applied in zones that blur the line between domestic enforcement and something that begins to look a great deal like a foreign military engagement. And this is where Claudia Scheinbaum's response becomes so important to understand, because she did not simply issue a diplomatic pleasantry, she drew a line. She reminded Washington and the world that Mexico is a sovereign nation, that its territory is its territory, that no foreign military, including the military of its largest trading partner and closest neighbor, has the right to operate on Mexican soil without Mexican authorization. And she said it with the kind of composed, measured firmness that you have to recognize as something deliberate. She is a scientist by training, Scheinbaum. She is not a firebrand. She doesn't perform outrage. When she speaks carefully, it is because she is saying something precise. And what she was saying precisely is this: we see what you are doing, we understand what it means, and we will not be silent about it. Now, the American political conversation around all of this has been predictably almost entirely focused on the domestic politics of it. Is Trump helping his base? Is this good for the Republican Party? How does this play in battleground states? And look, I understand why the media frames it that way, because that is the frame that gets clicks and keeps people engaged in the horse race. But it completely misses what is actually at stake in the larger structural sense. Because what is happening here is not primarily a story about American electoral politics. It is a story about power, about how the most powerful nation in the world chooses to exercise that power, about what the United States is willing to do to a neighboring country in the name of its own security and its own political priorities, and what the long-term consequences of those choices will be for the hemisphere and for the world. Think about this from Mexico's perspective for a moment. Mexico is not a small, isolated country with no leverage. It is the second largest economy in Latin America. It is one of the United States' top trading partners. Under the USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA and that Trump himself championed in his first term, the economic relationship between the two countries is deeply integrated. American businesses depend on Mexican manufacturing. American consumers depend on Mexican goods. The agricultural relationship alone is staggeringly complex. And now the United States is talking about deploying military force in ways that encroach on Mexican sovereignty. You have to ask yourself, what does this do to that relationship? What does this do to the trust, the cooperation, the diplomatic foundation that makes any of that economic integration possible? And the answer, if you're being honest, is that it damages it. It damages it in ways that are not immediately visible in quarterly earnings reports or trade statistics, but that accumulate over time into something that fundamentally reshapes how Mexico positions itself in the world. Because Mexico has options. Mexico has been deepening its relationships with China. Mexico has been deepening its relationships with other Latin American countries that are also watching what the United States does and drawing their own conclusions. When you treat a sovereign neighbor as if its borders are simply an extension of your own operational theater, you don't just create a diplomatic incident. You push that country slowly but perceptibly into the arms of your rivals. And history is absolutely full of examples of the United States doing exactly this in Latin America. using force or the threat of force to get short-term compliance from neighboring governments, and creating long-term blowback that lasted for generations. Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Nicaragua in the 1980s. The list goes on and on. These were not random events. They were exercises of American power, justified at the time in the language of security and national interest. And what they produced, in every case, was instability, resentment, authoritarian governments, economic devastation, and ultimately more migration, more refugees, more of the exact conditions that American politicians then pointed to as evidence that these countries were failed states that couldn't manage their own affairs. Do you see the cycle? Do you see how it perpetuates itself? The intervention creates the instability. The instability creates the migration. The migration gets used to justify more intervention. And at every stage of this cycle, the people at the bottom, the workers, the farmers, the families, are the ones who pay the price. The people at the top, the people who own the defense contractors, the people who own the private prison companies that profit from detention, the people who own the construction companies that build the walls and the fences, they do just fine. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not a fringe analysis. This is basic political economy. This is what happens when you follow the money and ask who benefits from the perpetuation of a crisis rather than its resolution. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that almost nobody in mainstream American media will say out loud. There are extremely powerful economic interests in the United States that do not want the border crisis solved. They want it managed. They want it controlled at a level that keeps it useful as a political mobilization tool, useful as a justification for military spending, useful as a source of cheap, exploitable, undocumented labor that has no legal protection and no ability to organize. Because undocumented workers have built enormous portions of the American economy. They work in agriculture, in construction, in food processing, in domestic labor, in hospitality. They pay into Social Security and Medicare. They pay sales taxes. They contribute enormously to the American economic machine, and they do it while living in a legal shadow that makes them maximally exploitable. If you actually solved the immigration crisis, if you created legal pathways, if you addressed the root economic causes, if you treated these human beings as the workers and contributors they actually are, you would disrupt a very profitable system. And the people who profit from that system have enormous influence over the politicians and the policies that shape this debate. So when you watch the Trump administration announce military operations at the border, and you watch the cameras roll, and you watch the helicopters and the uniformed personnel and the press conferences, I want you to see it for what it also is, a performance. Not entirely a performance. There are real people there. There are real operations happening. But it is also a performance of strength, a performance of control, designed for a specific domestic audience that has been told for years that the border is in chaos and that only dramatic, forceful action can restore order. It is designed to generate images that feel decisive, that feel powerful, that feel like leadership. Whether it actually solves anything is, from a political standpoint, almost secondary. What matters is that it looks like action. What matters is that it feeds the narrative. And Scheinbaum understands this too. She is not naive. She has been navigating a relationship with an enormously powerful neighbor for her entire political career. She understands that how Mexico responds to this moment matters not just for the immediate diplomatic situation, but for Mexico's positioning in the world over the next decade. If she capitulates, if she allows American military presence on Mexican soil without serious resistance, she sets a precedent that will be exploited again and again. If she overreacts, if she ruptures the diplomatic and economic relationship in ways that harm ordinary Mexicans, she loses political credibility at home and gives ammunition to her opponents. So she does exactly what a skilled, disciplined leader does. She asserts sovereignty clearly. She refuses to accept violations of it, and she leaves the door open for dialogue. It's careful, it's strategic, and it is frankly more sophisticated than most of what comes out of Washington on this topic. Now, let's zoom out even further. It is happening in the context of a much larger global realignment that is reshaping the entire international order. The United States is in a period of relative decline as a global hegemon, not collapse, decline. There's a difference. The American economy is still the largest in the world. American military power is still unmatched. But the era of unchallenged American dominance, the unipolar moment that followed the end of the Cold War, is over. China has risen to a level of economic and increasingly military power that means every decision the United States makes is now being watched, analyzed, and responded to not just by its neighbors, but by its rivals. Russia, despite the war in Ukraine and the enormous damage that war has done to its economy and its international standing, is still a nuclear power with significant influence in certain parts of the world. And across the global south, across Africa, across Latin America, across Southeast Asia, there is a growing movement of countries that are refusing to simply accept the rules and the frameworks that the United States and its Western allies wrote after World War II, as if those rules are natural law. They are saying these rules benefited the countries that wrote them. We want a say in how the world is organized. We want our interests represented. We want sovereignty respected. And this is why the United States' behavior toward Mexico matters far beyond the bilateral relationship. Every country in Latin America is watching. Every country that has ever felt the weight of American power, economic or military, is watching. When the United States sends troops to the border of a sovereign neighbor, even framed as a domestic security operation, the message it sends to the rest of the hemisphere is, your sovereignty is conditional. Your independence is respected only as long as it doesn't inconvenience us, only as long as your interests align with ours. The moment they diverge, we will use our power to bring you back into line. That message pushes governments, even governments that are broadly pro-American, even governments that benefit enormously from trade and investment ties with the United States, toward hedging, toward building relationships with China, with Russia, with regional blocs that can provide alternatives. Not because they love those alternatives, not because China or Russia are better partners in some moral sense, but because countries, like individuals, seek options when they feel threatened. And that process of hedging, of seeking alternatives, of building a more multipolar set of alliances that is happening across Latin America right now, and American border policy, American foreign policy is actively accelerating it. What is also happening simultaneously, and this is crucial to understand, is that the internal contradictions of American capitalism are reaching a kind of breaking point that is driving much of this political instability. The United States is a country of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary inequality. The productivity of American workers has increased dramatically over the last 40 years. The wages of American workers have not kept pace. The profits have gone to shareholders, to executives, to the ownership class, and the working class, the white working class, the black working class, the Latino working class, the multiracial working class that actually produces the goods and services that constitute the American economy, has been squeezed, stressed, and told in 100 different ways that their declining living standards are somebody else's fault. The immigrants' fault, the foreign workers' fault, China's fault, anyone's fault except the fundamental structure of an economy organized to maximize returns to capital at the expense of labor. And here's the political genius of what is happening, and I use the word genius not admiringly, but analytically. Here is the political genius of the border narrative. It takes the very real economic anxiety of the American working class, anxiety that is justified, anxiety that reflects real material conditions of declining wages, and rising costs and hollowed out communities, and it redirects that anxiety away from the economic system that produced it and toward the migrants and the foreign countries that are framed as the cause. It is a redirection. It is a sleight of hand. And it works. It works because human beings, when they are suffering, want a concrete explanation. They want someone to point to. And immigrants are visible, they are tangible, and they are politically powerless, which makes them a safe target. You cannot lose votes by attacking people who cannot vote. You can only gain votes among people who have been told that those immigrants are the reason their town is dying, their wages are stagnant, their children can't afford houses. But immigrants are not the reason those towns are dying. The offshoring of manufacturing is the reason. The destruction of unions is the reason. The financialization of the economy is the reason. The systematic defunding of public services and public education is the reason. These are the forces that hollowed out the American working class over 40 years, and they were enacted by policies chosen by politicians who were funded by the same ownership class that now profits from the border crisis narrative. You cannot understand what Trump is doing at the border without understanding this larger economic and political context, because the border is not primarily a policy issue. It is primarily a political and economic instrument. It is a way of managing the contradictions of a system that cannot acknowledge its own failures without collapsing the ideological framework that justifies it. And the people in the middle of all of this, the migrants themselves, they are human beings. Let's not lose sight of that. They are not abstractions. They are not a policy problem. They are people who left everything, their homes, their families, their communities, because the conditions of their lives made staying impossible. Some fled violence. Some fled poverty created by trade policies written in Washington. Some fled climate disruption that has made their land unfarmable. All of them made an agonizing decision that no human being makes lightly, and they are now caught in the middle of a political battle between American electoral politics and Mexican sovereignty, between American military ambition and the limits of international law, between the enormous power of the United States and the much more constrained but still real power of a neighboring government that is trying to protect its people and its territory with the tools available to it. When Scheinbaum responds to Trump, she is not just responding on behalf of Mexican government policy. She is responding on behalf of every Mexican citizen who has watched American power encroach on their country's autonomy. She is responding on behalf of the Mexican workers whose labor built American supply chains. She is responding on behalf of a democratic tradition in Mexico that has its own history, its own struggles, its own hard-won progress. Mexico has its own problems, serious ones, including the extraordinary power of the drug cartels, which are themselves a product partly of American drug consumption and American gun sales flowing south across the border. The cartels are not a Mexican problem in isolation. They are a binational problem. They are fed by American demand for drugs and American supply of weapons. Any honest analysis has to include that. Any serious policy response has to address that. But unilateral American military operations in or near Mexican territory are not an honest analysis, and they are not a serious policy response. They are a political performance that makes the underlying problem worse while providing the appearance of decisive action. So, where does this go? That is the question that matters most for Americans trying to understand what this means for their country and their world. And the honest answer is that we are at a genuine decision point, not a dramatic instant, but a slow-moving one whose choices in the next few years will shape decades. The United States can double down on unilateral military posturing, treat neighbors as operational theaters rather than sovereign partners, scapegoat migrants for structural economic failures, and in doing so, accelerate its own isolation, deepen resentment, push the hemisphere toward rival powers, and solve none of the underlying drivers of migration and instability. Or it can choose a harder path, address the economic policies that destroyed livelihoods in Central America and Mexico, treat migration as the humanitarian and economic phenomenon it is, rather than an invasion narrative, build genuine multilateral partnerships based on mutual respect, challenge powerful interests, confront the link between American trade policy and Latin American migration, treat Mexican sovereignty as real, and foster an honest conversation about American capitalism and the human crises at its borders. A conversation not happening in Washington or mainstream media, but unfolding among people seeking deeper understanding. That is why this moment, Trump's announcement, Scheinbaum's response, the troops, the border, the geopolitical context matters, not because it will be resolved cleanly, but because it reveals the forces shaping the world now: power and its limits, capital and its contradictions, sovereignty and its defense, and the human beings caught in the middle, trying to survive decisions made far above them. That's what's happening, and it deserves your attention.